A long time ago, I traveled from Hong Kong to New York. I spent a week in San Francisco on my way. I hadn't been to that city in a while. During my time in the Orient, my business had done very well, and I had become rich. Now, I could visit my own country and reconnect with old friends from my youth. One of my closest friends was Mohan Dampier. We used to be schoolmates, but our communication had faded away over time. You might have noticed that people tend to write fewer friendly letters as the distance between them increases. It's just a common tendency. I remembered Mohan as a good-looking, strong guy who liked books. He didn't like to work much and didn't care about many of the things that most people value, like money. He had inherited enough wealth to live comfortably. His family was one of the oldest and most prestigious in the country. They were proud that none of their members had ever been involved in business or politics or achieved any kind of fame. Mohan was a bit sentimental, and he had a unique interest in strange and mysterious things. He studied all sorts of mysterious subjects, but he didn't let them lead him to crazy beliefs. He ventured into the world of the unknown while staying rooted in what we consider to be certain and true. The night I visited him was stormy. It was wintertime in California, and the rain was pouring down hard. It splashed on the empty streets and pounded against the houses with great force because of the strong winds. It was quite a challenge for my taxi driver to find Mohan's house, which was located in a less crowded area near the ocean. The house itself looked a bit plain, and I couldn't see any flowers or grass in the yard because of the darkness. There were a few trees outside, swaying and making noises in the storm. They seemed like they were trying to escape from their gloomy surroundings and find a better place at sea. The house was made of bricks and had 2 floors, with a taller tower on one corner. The only light I could see came from a window in that tower. Something about the place gave me a creepy feeling, which might have been made worse by the rainwater running down my back as I hurried to the front door for shelter. In response to my message telling him I wanted to visit, Dampier wrote, "Don't ring the doorbell, just come in and come up." So I did just that. I went up the stairs, and there was only one dim light at the top of the second set of stairs. Luckily, I made it to the landing without falling, and I walked into the well-lit square room in the tower. Dampier, wearing a robe and slippers, greeted me warmly. Any worries I had about his welcoming vanished when I saw him. He looked different. Even though he was still relatively young, his hair had turned gray, and he had a noticeable hunch in his back. He looked skinny and bony, with a face full of deep wrinkles and a very pale complexion. His eyes were strangely large, and they glowed with an almost eerie intensity. He seated me, offered me a cigar, and sincerely told me how happy he was to see me. We had some small talk, but the whole time I couldn't help but feel sad about how much he had changed. He must have noticed because he suddenly said, with a somewhat cheerful smile, "You're disappointed in me, nonsum qualis eram." I wasn't quite sure how to respond, but I managed to say, "Well, to be honest, I don't know." "Your Latin is still the same." He brightened up again. No, he said, since Latin is a dead language, it becomes more appropriate. But please be patient and wait. Maybe where I'm going, there's a better language. Would you like to receive a message in it? His smile faded as he spoke, and he looked into my eyes with a seriousness that troubled me. However, I didn't want to let his thoughts of death affect me too much. I think it'll be a long time, I said, before we stop using human language, and by then, the need for it will have passed. He didn't reply, and I stayed quiet too, as our conversation had taken a gloomy turn, and I didn't know how to make it more pleasant. Suddenly, during a break in the storm when the silence was almost startling after the previous noise, I heard a soft tapping sound. It seemed to come from the wall behind my chair. It wasn't like someone knocking on a door for entry, but more like a signal or a sign that someone was in the next room. I think most of us have experienced such signals before, even if we don't like to talk about them. I looked at Dampier. If there was any amusement in my expression, he didn't notice. He seemed to have forgotten I was there and was staring at the wall behind me with an expression in his eyes that I can't describe, although I remember it vividly. The situation was awkward, so I decided to leave. That's when he seemed to snap out of it. "Please, have a seat," he said. "It's nothing, no one is there." But the tapping continued, slow and gentle, just like before. "Excuse me," I said, "it's getting late. Can I come back tomorrow?" He smiled, although it seemed a bit forced. "You're very considerate," he said, "but it's not necessary. Honestly, this is the only room in the tower, and there's no one in there. At least." He didn't finish his sentence, got up, and opened a window, the only opening in the wall where the sound was coming from. "Look." Not sure what else to do, I followed him to the window and looked outside. A street lamp some distance away provided enough light through the rainy darkness to clearly show that no one was there. There was nothing but the flat wall of the tower. Dampier closed the window and motioned for me to sit down again. The incident wasn't particularly mysterious in itself. There could have been a dozen explanations, although none came to mind. Yet it left a strange impression on me, especially because of my friend's attempt to reassure me, which somehow made it seem more significant. He had shown that no one was there, but that was the only interesting part. He didn't offer an explanation, and his silence was frustrating and made me a bit annoyed. "My dear friend," I said, somewhat sarcastically, "I don't mean to question your right to have as many ghosts as you like as your companions. It's none of my business. But as a practical person, mostly concerned with the real world, I don't find ghosts comforting. I'm going back to my hotel, where my fellow guests are still alive." It wasn't a very polite thing to say, but he didn't seem to mind. "Please, stay," he said. "I appreciate your presence here. What you heard tonight, I believe I've heard twice before. Now I know it wasn't my imagination. That means a lot to me, more than you can understand. Have another cigar and some patience while I tell you the story." The rain was now falling more steadily, making a soft, continuous sound. Occasionally, the wind would pick up, making the tree branches swish and sway. It was late at night, but my curiosity and sympathy kept me as a willing listener to my friend's story. I didn't interrupt him once from start to finish. 10 years ago, he began, I lived in a ground floor apartment in a row of houses at the other end of town, on Rincon Hill. This used to be a fancy neighborhood in San Francisco but had fallen into disrepair. That happened partly because the old-fashioned houses didn't match the tastes of the wealthier people anymore, and partly because some public changes had messed it up. The row of houses where I lived was set back from the street. Each house had a small garden, separated from the neighbors by low iron fences. A neat gravel path ran from the gate to the front door of each house. One morning, as I was leaving my place, I saw a young girl going into the garden next door. It was a warm June day, and she wore a simple white dress. On her head, she had a white straw hat covered in flowers and ribbons, as was the style back then. But I didn't focus on her outfit for long because her face was otherworldly. I won't describe it, for fear of cheapening it with words, but it was incredibly beautiful. It was like all the beauty I had ever seen or imagined was in that one stunning living picture, created by a divine artist. I was so moved by it that, without even thinking about it, I took off my hat. The young woman didn't seem upset, she just looked at me with her magnificent dark eyes, and I caught my breath. Then, without saying anything, she went inside the house. I stood there for a moment, hat in hand, aware of how impolite I had been, but still overwhelmed by the beauty I had witnessed. Afterward, I continued on my way, but it felt like a piece of my heart had stayed behind. Normally, I would have stayed away until nightfall, but that afternoon, I found myself back in the small garden, pretending to be interested in the flowers, which I had never cared about before. But my hope was in vain, she didn't appear. After a restless night, I spent the next day expecting to see her but ended up disappointed. However, on the following day, while wandering around the neighborhood without any particular purpose, I crossed paths with her. Of course, I didn't repeat my mistake of taking off my hat or even look at her for too long to show any interest. But my heart was racing, and I trembled as she turned her big, dark eyes toward me with a look that clearly recognized me, without being bold or flirtatious. I won't bore you with all the details, but I saw the young woman many more times after that. Still, I never spoke to her or tried to get to know her. I didn't make any efforts to become acquainted. You might wonder why I held back so much. Well, even though I was deeply in love, I couldn't change who I was. I was what some people call an aristocrat. Despite her beauty and charm, she wasn't from my social class. I knew her name and something about her family. She was an orphan, a niece of the elderly, overweight woman who ran the boarding house where she lived. My income was small, and I didn't have the inclination for marriage. It might even be a talent, you know. Marrying into that family would mean adopting their way of life, leaving behind my books and studies, and socially lowering myself. It's easy to criticize these considerations, and I won't defend myself too strongly. But if there's any justice, my ancestors for generations should be co-defendants, and I should be allowed to argue that heredity played a big role in my choices. Every drop of my family's blood spoke against a marriage like that. In short, my tastes, habits, instincts, and what little reason my love had left me, all went against it. Besides, I was an incorrigible romantic. I found a certain charm in an impersonal and spiritual connection that acquaintance might cheapen and marriage would surely destroy. I believed that no woman could be what this lovely girl appeared to be. Love is a delightful dream, why should I wake up? The logical thing, given all this sense and sentiment, was to leave. Honor, pride, prudence, and the preservation of my ideals all told me to go away, but I was too weak. The most I could do, with a great effort of will, was to stop running into her. And I did that. I even avoided the chance encounters in the garden, only leaving my place when I knew she was at her music lessons, and coming back after dark. But during that time, I was like someone in a dream, lost in fascinating fantasies, and organizing my entire intellectual life around that dream. Oh, my friend, as someone who usually acts rationally, you can't understand the paradise of foolishness I lived in. One evening, I was feeling like an unspeakable idiot. The devilish idea came to me to do something utterly foolish. I casually asked my chatty landlady about the young woman's room, which, as it turned out, was right next to mine, separated by a common wall. Giving in to a sudden and crude urge, I lightly knocked on the wall. As expected, there was no response, but I was in no mood to take a hint. I was in a kind of madness and repeated the foolish act, even though it was offensive. Still, there was no response, and I finally had the decency to stop. An hour later, while I was engrossed in my studies, something incredible happened. I thought I heard a reply to my signal. I dropped my books and rushed to the wall. My heart was pounding as I tapped on the wall 3 times, just as I had before. This time, there was a clear and unmistakable response, 1, 2, 3, exactly repeating my signal. That was all I could get, but it was too much. For many nights after that, this madness continued, with me always having the last word. I was deliriously happy during that time, but I stubbornly held on to my decision not to see her. Then, as I should have expected, I stopped getting any replies. I thought to myself, she's probably disgusted with my timidity in not making a more direct move. So, I decided to find her, get to know her, and, what? I didn't know, and I still don't know what might have happened. All I can say is that I spent days trying to meet her, but it was all in vain. She seemed to be invisible as well as inaudible. I wandered the streets where we had met, but she never showed up. I watched the garden in front of her house from my window, but she never came in or went out. I sank into deep despair, thinking she had left, yet I didn't bother asking my landlady to confirm this, as I had grown to dislike her for speaking of the girl with less reverence than I deemed appropriate. Then came a fateful night. Exhausted by my emotions, my indecision, and my hopelessness, I had gone to bed early and had fallen into a fitful sleep. In the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up, wide awake, listening intensely for I knew not what. It was as if some malevolent force was determined to destroy my peace. Then I thought I heard a faint tapping on the wall, a faint echo of the familiar signal. It was repeated after a few moments, 1, 2, 3. It was no louder than before, but it was aimed at a mind that was alert and ready to receive it. I was about to respond when a wicked idea came over me. She had ignored me for so long, now I would ignore her. It was a crazy decision, and may God forgive me for it. I spent the rest of the night awake, justifying my stubbornness with flimsy excuses, and listening. Late the following morning, as I was leaving the house, I ran into my landlady, who was coming in. "Good morning, Mr. Dampier," she said. "Have you heard the news?" I replied with words that I hadn't heard any news and with an attitude that I didn't want to hear any. She didn't pick up on my attitude. "It's about the young lady next door who's been sick," she said. "What? You didn't know? She's been ill for weeks. And now..." I almost jumped at her. "And now," I cried, "what happened?" "She is dead." But that's not the whole story. In the middle of the night, as I later found out, the young woman, waking from a long daze after a week of confusion, had made one last request, her final words. She asked, in her weakened state, for her bed to be moved to the other side of the room. The people taking care of her thought it was just a strange, confused request, but moved the bed as she wished. And it was there, on the opposite side of the room, that her departing soul tried to fix a broken connection, a precious thread of love and feelings between her innocence and a terrible wrong that blindly followed the law of self. What could I do to make up for it? Are there special prayers or words that can help the souls that wander on nights like this, spirits blown about by the invisible winds, appearing in storms and darkness with signs and omens, hints of memories, and predictions of doom? This is the third time it has happened. The first time, I was too skeptical to do anything beyond checking the incident with natural explanations. The second time, I responded to the signal after it had been repeated several times, but with no result. Tonight's event completes the fatal triad explained by Parapelius Necromantius. There's nothing more to tell. When Dampier finished his story, I couldn't think of anything appropriate to say, and it would have been rude to question him further. Acknowledged with a silent handshake. That night, he was left alone with his sorrow and guilt, passing into the unknown. He died.